It's been 15 years since there was nonstop service between the US and Romania, and over 20 years since a Romanian carrier performed these flights. Just before the closure of 2023, however, HiSky received their current and only A330, and within a week, they announced the plans for this route, launching in June of this year, which makes me think the plans were set for a while, they just needed it to be physically possible before sharing it with the world. At launch, it sounds like they planned on it operating similar to Norse with a basic economy type service with no checked bags, seats, and an online check-in, although it did sound like they planned to offer food for all passengers for free. So, New York. I guess it kind of makes sense for a couple reasons. For starters, New York definitely has the most Romanians in the Western Hemisphere with just over 160,000. California ranking second most with San Francisco and Los Angeles combining for about the same as New York. It's just that flights there are much tougher with the A330s, and New York has much more European tourism. HiSky did also express an interest in Canada. It sounds like Toronto will be their next destination, although Montreal isn't ruled out as another city previously with Romanian flights. That'll be in a date to come, however, because for now, we are here in Bucharest to try the new connection between Romania and the United States. Here at the Bucharest airport, it seems like there is a departures building and an arrivals building. Inside the departures lobby in this early morning departure, you can see just how packed it was. The departures lobby is then broken down into two sections. There's a renovated section, and then this area, which is a little bit older. HiSky, being newer and smaller, uses this older section of the departures wing. We found the check-in desks pertaining to the New York departure, and as with most flights to the US, there was an extra security check that all passengers went through, which was nothing more than just an extra passport verification. The entire row was for the New York-bound flight, and there wasn't any signs or anything directing passengers, so it was kind of just a mad huddle of people trying to find the right desk. There was actually a business class row, however it wasn't explicitly marked until I asked someone about it. They went in, made the changes, and then people were able to find their lines. There was a passport and security check next to our check-in desks, however it doesn't seem like this checkpoint gets used anymore. So, through the maze of the terminal, we end up in the renovated part of the departures wing. This houses the current passport and security check and also houses the more bougie airlines, if you want to call it that, like Qatar and Turkish. It also houses the flag carrier of Romania, Tarom. Through security, there's a fork in the road, and we head off to the right to get to the main terminal building. Speaking of which, back in the 90s, they announced the expansion plans for the Bucharest airport, predominantly focusing on expanding the capability of international departures. This was right before they joined the Schengen area, and shortly thereafter announcing multiple flights to the US and Canada. The first part of the terminal that you walk through is all the gates for the Schengen destinations. You don't have to head through any passport control. There is a lounge shared by all airlines, and other than that, there's a collection of about 10 gates or so. If we continue a little bit further, we'll find the passport control for those people leaving the European Union and Schengen area. Heading through a passport check, we get into the remainder of the terminal, which doesn't house more than a few gates. This houses all the departures, however, to North America, in addition to those going to places like Turkey. Just like before passport control, there is a lounge upstairs that doesn't belong to any single airline. Any business class traveler on an airline leaving the Schengen area has access to this upstairs lounge. You can see that there is not a ton of seating, but there's also not a ton of passengers. At this given time, there was two flights. There was one leaving to Paris, and there was our flight. Unfortunately, the state of most of the lounge is a little crummy. There was some trash left about. The seat cushions and the carpet were also fairly dirty. Behind that, however, was a bunch more seating, especially seating against the windows, giving you a better view of the outside world and the aircraft passing by. And at the back of the lounge, there is a smoking area. The buffet was oh so European. Tons of bread, meats, and cheeses, and that was pretty much it. I did appreciate a little bit more creativity, at least, besides just cold cuts amongst the meat options. It had been about 24 hours since my last meal, so this breakfast buffet, even if it was fairly European, was definitely welcomed. I got my spread of meats and cheeses and also a Romanian-style pizza to go with my coffee and yogurt. I was able to grab a seat along the window, which was fortunate because charging ports were rare, pretty much just these big stanchions around the lounge. However, this seat did afford me not only the ability to charge my device, but also to get a great view outside of all the arriving and departing aircraft. As a matter of fact, it was from the lounge where I saw our plane being towed over from. This is a 14-year-old A330-200 but has only been with HiSky since last December, flying previously for Sichuan Airlines in China before being put into storage. It was briefly registered for a small wet leasing charter company, but doesn't seem to have flown with them. Since taking delivery, it appears to have done some intra-Europe flights in April and May, before being used for the New York inaugural on June 7th and remaining on that route ever since. I will admit it was kind of a bummer not to see a flagship Tarom lounge. I will say, however, that it was nice to have a lounge in any sort considering HiFly is such a new and small airline. Upon check-in, before they handed me my boarding pass, they called up to the lounge to give them my name and my seat number so that they could check me in upon arrival. It was a couple minutes before our scheduled boarding time, so I decided to head back down into the terminal and go wait near my gate. Much like at check-in, there wasn't any specifically labeled business class queue. There was a long line of economy class passengers, but the business class passengers I could see were just kind of waiting off to the side, so I went ahead and joined them there. Unfortunately, it didn't afford great views of our aircraft from the terminal, so I guess we'll have to wait to New York to see if we can get a better shot. Finally, they called for boarding. Not specifically business class, just boarding in general. So, the business class passengers that were standing off to the side just had to kind of file in with the rest of the line. Now, there's not a whole lot out there about this flight or this cabin, so I was fairly curious about what I'd find once I got on board. What I found was a 222 interior. As a matter of fact, it seems like they've continued to use Sichuan Airlines interior to a T. Maybe changing the colors, considering, to my knowledge, Sichuan uses a red interior, this obviously being blue, but the same seat style and setup that we would have seen when this aircraft was operating over in China. Looking around my seat here on the back right of the aircraft, you'll see they've adorned the HiSky logo on the headrest, which is adjustable by tilting or curling in the edges. I will admit that while old, the seat cushion is so worn it's like sitting in an old comfy couch. There is also a footrest here that can fold out once the leg rest is extended. The two reading lights for each seat can be moved on a stiff arm and swiveled to turn on and off. The headset and charging ports were below that, although the flight attendants mentioned that these wouldn't be enabled until we got into the air. Between the seats is also an armrest for each passenger. That armrest can be raised to access a little bit of storage underneath. To help with privacy between you and your neighbor, you can raise this little partition. It's not great when you're sitting up, although it's better than nothing, especially once you're lying down. We can also move each piece of the seat individually via the seat adjustments up on the counter. There is a fairly good sized counter here for whatever you might have, presumably drinks, but if you have something else there's a little piece that swivels out of the side where you can store your drink instead. On the front of that console is where they store the seatback entertainment screens. They were stored and latched for takeoff, taxi, and landing, but once we got in flight, they were turned on and we were able to look through them. It does, however, make it look a little funky on the seat back in front of us with no TV there. Instead, a big literature pocket, a big storage pocket, and the coat hook. There is a cutout here, which was good when the seat was reclined. There is no storage allowed, as a matter of fact. Even though it fit my backpack, they made me put my backpack in the overhead bins for takeoff and landing. Although these setups typically have less privacy, it is fortunate that they usually have more windows, so especially if you have a seatmate, you don't have to worry about hogging all the space. The armrest along the window also lifts up. It stores the tray table, which can pull out with the little lever here and swivel into place. Unfortunately, as with most A330s, there is no overhead air vents. As far as amenities before takeoff, we were offered orange juice or sparkling wine, and then still or sparkling water, but that was it. I will say that the only bummer is just how long it took us to board. Presumably because of visa checks, but for whatever reason, there was an average of about one passenger every 30 to 45 seconds, so it took us forever to fill the cabin and resulted in us taking off late. As a matter of fact, 11 out of the 33 flights that have operated this route so far have arrived over an hour late. Partially, most likely, because of the boarding, but also the flight is scheduled for 9.5 hours, but actually takes 10. It just doesn't work with JFK's astronomical taxi times. If you've never heard of HiSky, you probably aren't alone. It isn't Romania's flag carrier, which is Tarom, but instead a privately owned airline jointly between Romania and Moldova. Technically, Moldova's airline is HiSky and Romania's is HiSky Europe. In 2019, the airline was founded by a Moldovan pilot. For a while, they were unable to fly due to issues with their air operator certificate. That didn't stop them from selling their first flights from Chisinau. They also announced they'd be leasing two A320s, making it seem like they were actually about to do this thing, when in reality they were still a ways away from their first flight. The problem didn't lie solely with their operating certifications, but also the COVID pandemic hitting right at the wrong time. Between those issues, they removed all planned flights through September of 2020. Finally, in December of 2020, they obtained their proper certifications in Romania to launch HiSky Europe, and 2 months later, the Moldovan certification came through to launch HiSky. It took until April 2021 for the first flight to occur when they finally flew from Chisinau to Paris, later adding Frankfurt and Dublin from Baia Mare and Iasi. This has brought them to present day, where Moldovan HiSky has 1 aircraft to 4 cities, and Romanian HiSky Europe with 7 aircraft to 21 cities. I would have thought that they'd try to focus on connecting southeastern Europe to the rest of Europe, and eventually the rest of the world. This doesn't seem to be their plan, however, focusing more on connecting the people that live in Romania to all the places they might want to vacation in, although they have definitely shown their interest in intercontinental flying. At this time, they still only have 9 total aircraft, with this being their sole widebody. As a matter of fact, it's the only airline with a widebody in southeastern Europe besides Serbia, and once again Turkey, depending on if you count it as Europe or Asia. So that alone is something impressive on its own, but I am curious to see just how big and how quickly this airline is able to grow. After takeoff, I figured I'd explore the seatback entertainment options. Unfortunately, for a little while it was still locked by the crew. Eventually, however, it was unlocked and we were able to browse. It was broken down pretty simply into entertainment and help, pretty much entertainment being the only useful option with videos and audio. The caveat being the audio section was blocked. Looking through the entertainment was a little bit interesting considering that they didn't separate it by movies and TV shows. Instead, everything was thrown in here into a seemingly collection of English, French, and what I'm assuming is Romanian. You'll see, however, looking at Young Sheldon, instead of having each individual episodes, it's instead just an hour 20-minute block of Young Sheldon where the episodes will play sequentially. Not the end of the world, considering that, especially on these long flights, you want to just continue watching show after show, but it's a little tough to keep track of where you are if you do have to stop in the middle. I did appreciate the favorites button, although admittedly there's only 1 or 2 things on here that I actually wanted to watch. I will warn you that the touch wasn't perfectly calibrated, however, so I ended up accidentally starting a bunch of programs. Despite my best efforts, I wasn't able to get the map to load. Instead, I had to use the bottom right of the screen where I could keep track of our journey length and how much time we had left. somewhat expected on a 14-year-old aircraft that's still so new to HiSky, but there is no in-flight Wi-Fi available. I will also warn you that at no point during the flights did my charging ports actually begin working. The same goes for the rest of them in the business class cabin. In a somewhat interesting fashion, they passed out the rest of the amenities once we were on climb out from Bucharest. They included, for starters, the bedding, which had this small pillow, and also a blanket that was pretty good in size even if it was fairly thin. We also got these low-grade, non-noise cancelling headphones. Amenity kits aren't necessarily always a given on these small airlines, so I was pleasantly surprised to see one upon boarding. It included some normal stuff like socks and earplugs and eye mask. It did also include a fun little case for the toothbrush and toothpaste, and also a hairbrush with mirror attached. There were no menus for this flight. Instead, the flight attendants asked if we wanted to join for brunch, and I said yes. The plate I was given was an option that we're just going to call the bread option. It included a crepe, not really anything inside of it, kinda just a crepe. Also had an assortment of pastries, a cake for dessert, and then 2 separate bread rolls. Honestly, if gluten's not your thing, Eastern Europe probably shouldn't be your thing either. I also went with a cup of coffee, considering I was trying to stay awake for the remainder of the flight. Once the meal was collected, I was curious to see just how reclined I could get this seat. Obviously, you can see it starts in a fully seated position where it does have presets for resting and the full bed. As I brought it to the fully flat position, you can see that the armrest also moves with it. Now, I kinda had my expectations set just from past flying seats like this. It's not a completely lie-flat seat. Instead, more of what we would call an angled lie-flat seat, meaning that even though the cushion does sit fairly flat, it's not 180 degrees flat as compared to the rest of the cabin. This is best exemplified where the seat cushion meets the leg rest, and you can see the change in the angle. You can also fold out the footrest, which is nice in these angled lie-flat seats considering gravity wants to slide you right off. And lastly, for a little bit of privacy, you can raise that partition between the seats. Unfortunately, the pillow was pretty small, but I guess it's better than nothing. I was, however, pleasantly surprised by the blanket. It was somewhat thin, but pretty plush, so it kept you plenty warm. I was also surprised by the size of it. Usually blankets that look like this are fairly small. However, it covered me from my shoulders to my toes without any issues, especially when tossing or turning. Now, this seat setup does allow a fair amount of space if you sleep on your back for your feet to move left and right. The only drawback is if you're a side sleeper, you don't have a ton of space, especially if you have to offset your feet. Another drawback to sleep that I'll add is just how dry the cabins of these A330s get. So much so, in fact, that I got a gnarly bloody nose and had to keep some tissues on me for the rest of the flight. Just keep that in mind, considering if you go to sleep, you'll probably wake up halfway through your flight with the worst case of cottonmouth you've ever had. The lavatories are fairly basic. Some airlines do like to add their own touches, although from what I've seen, HiSky seems to present itself as more of a budget carrier. As such, there's no flowers in the flower holder, and there's no amenities up on the amenities shelf. While we don't have any official load factor numbers from HiSky just yet, we do know that their A330s hold a total of 274 people, with 24 in business and 250 in economy. On today's flight, on a Friday, the best day for vacation travelers, there was only 5 people in business class, a few more once the crew joined, and by the looks of it, less than half of economy class was booked. This isn't a great sign, since long-haul services can only survive based on premium passengers and freight, since even a full economy cabin would still have the flight operating at a loss, and there didn't seem to be much cargo, and definitely wasn't many premium passengers. The pre-arrival meal consisted of salmon or chicken. I chose the salmon option, and honestly, the fish wasn't that bad. It was just a little dry, especially with that rice. It did come with a beet salad and a little cake that was fantastic. It must just not be my style, but having 2 rolls of bread with each meal is just overkill for me. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen service between Bucharest and New York. The route was previously served by Tarom, the Romanian flag carrier, since the 70s, using their 707s and eventually A310s, but was suspended in 2003 after too much financial strain. The last flight was on November 19th of that year, and the pilot described it as the day Tarom died, being the last time we'd see the Tarom logo flying across the Atlantic. Tarom did attempt to revive China and US routes, but couldn't secure aircraft after losing their A310s. They did submit a request for 787s on lease in 2018, but then we never heard anything further. Funny enough, earlier this year, right around when HiSky announced this route, Tarom announced it would also be bringing service to the US, but New York and Miami, which obviously raised some eyebrows since they still didn't have an aircraft for it. That didn't stop the marketing, however, and more surprisingly, it didn't stop them from selling tickets. What it actually ended up being was a misadvertised code-share one-stop service, connecting with SkyTeam partners Air Europa and ITA in Madrid and Rome respectively. After Tarom suspended the route in 2003, Delta began serving the New York to Bucharest market with a 767-300 in 2007. It lasted until 2009 when they finally pulled the service after recording only a 72% load factor during that time, reaching as high as 80 to 85% in peak summer seasons, much lower than their other European markets. And from the looks of it, this route ain't doing too hot either. So obviously, it would help to attract connecting passengers, right? Well, HiSky doesn't make that easy. Remember, they still don't have a huge network. Predominantly, HiSky just connects Romania to Central and Western Europe, both of which have plenty of connectivity to North America already. When this route was first launched, it only allowed passengers to book point-to-point between Bucharest and New York. It wouldn't even allow a connecting journey to or from the US. This is loosened so that you can now connect to a couple destinations in Romania, Chisinau, and Tel Aviv. Interesting when you realize that Bucharest is the fourth largest city that wasn't connected to the US after Tirana, Budapest, and Podgorica. So maybe HiSky can find a way to connect those cities as a cheaper alternative to the mainline carriers. It is an interesting way of selling tickets considering the New York to Bucharest market sees an average of only 72 daily passengers up to 90-ish in peak travel months. That alone won't be enough to keep this route working. In April 2023, HiSky first announced their intentions of North America flights. I would assume this was on their minds from day one, considering small airlines like this don't typically jump straight to transcontinental goals. In those first announcements, the plan was to use the A321LR via Dublin, which is obviously much more convenient considering load factors. A fifth Freedom flight would allow two markets to share one airplane. I mean, maybe there's a reason this is the only Romanian wide-body aircraft in years. I guess we'll have to see how this route fares over time. Will it last? Will they end up switching it to a narrow-body? Only time will tell, but for now, it's a fun and cheap way to get to Eastern Europe from North America. Now obviously, in the fun and ever-evolving aviation world, every new route is a fun one, and the US to Eastern Europe market is incredibly thin, especially Southeast Europe. We see Air Serbia with routes to Chicago and New York, but that's really the only other one operated by a foreign carrier. The big three US airlines do operate to Greece, and United has their seasonal Dubrovnik service. There's also Istanbul, which once again could be considered Europe or Asia. Other than that, the furthest you can get in Europe with direct US service is Poland, Austria, or Prague. That means this HiSky service should be a great tool to connect Southeastern Europe and the US, or at least it would be if their network supported that. Their main goal at this moment seems to be connecting the Romanian vacationers with New York, allowing for very limited connection capability, as mentioned previously. Due to the lack of competition, however, they have a bit more freedom to save money by cutting some services, since they aren't trying to be the best, just trying to offer service to an untapped market. They definitely don't have the best lounge in the world, and their business class is one of the more ancient looks in the world. Their meals are pretty bland and weak, and their amenities are super basic. But the main thing, it doesn't entirely matter, because they're the only option if someone wants to fly round trip, non-stop. This does come at an increased cost, however. They've got round trip averaging around $750 in economy and business for $2,100. Definitely more than other carriers' one-stop service, like LOT for example, has this for 500 in economy and 2,000 in business. But I guess they're banking on people paying for the convenience of a non-stop option. The service is operated 4 times weekly at the moment on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. It's also listed as a year-round service, but I wouldn't be surprised if they made it a summer seasonal, since at the moment it appears that the airplane is being used for winter charters. They also announced that they intend to launch Canadian services since acquiring their foreign air carrier license from the Canadian Transportation Agency in April. Bucharest has had Canadian flights before to Montreal and Toronto, most recently with Air Canada Rouge's 767s, but it was suspended in 2019 after just 1 year. It sounds like Toronto is HiSky's goal due to the Romanian population there and the tourism draw, similar to New York. The only issue, unless they use that A321LR on a 5th Freedom route, they only have the one A330, so they'll either need another aircraft or reduce New York service to free this plane up enough. It doesn't appear that this flight is all that full now, but that doesn't have to be the end of the world. Some airlines will operate flights to the US even at a loss due to diplomatic or exposure reasons. Just look at Kenya Airways' New York flight, or the San Francisco service that Miat Mongolian has been trying to start forever. Regardless, as I see it, HiSky will need to connect to more of the US, which can be done through airline partners, since I doubt they'll join any alliance. Realistically, without this, I don't see this route lasting all that long with the current loads, but what do y'all think? Let me know down below, and until next Sunday, safe travels. I'll see y'all next time.